Welcome to the Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Tonight, we're going to be talking about faith and how it's different than belief and how it's different than hope, and how each of those can make it rational to have a long-term commitment to God. So it's going to be an interesting discussion, and thank you so much, Dr. Liz Jackson, for joining me again.
Absolutely. I've been on here a few times and always love our chats. And I guess this is the first time I've been on without Justin. I think in a while, maybe. So
Yeah,
anyway,
that's actually, I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. The last few times you've been on with Justin Mooney.
because we did two of them. We did like the series that was like grad school and then doing philosophical research. And then we had that co-authored paper. And I think that co-authored paper was the last time I was on. But maybe
Right. So
well,
yeah,
yeah.
I've lost count of how many times you've been on. You're definitely, if you're not in first place, Andrew might be in first place, but you might be in second place.
I take this competition very seriously. So watch out, Andrew.
All right. So you wrote this paper. Well, you wrote it a while ago, but it got published in 2021.
Yeah, that's
Last
right.
year.
So I wrote it kind of at the end of grad school and then sort of worked on it through my postdoc. And yeah, it came out last year. So
I'm excited to talk about it with you. Has anyone else interviewed you on this paper?
I mean, I think some of the themes from this paper have come up in other interviews, but one thing I think is like cool and distinctive about your channel is that you often like really actually go through the content of the paper like specifically and in order. And so in terms of that, I don't think I've ever done an interview.
Cool. So this should be, I think a lot of this will be new to people. Maybe if you've watched every video Liz does, like me, then this might be familiar. But I think for a lot of people it'll be new. All right, let's jump in. So we've mentioned this paper. It's called Belief, Faith, Hope, and Rational Commitment, or something like that.
Yeah, I kind of added the end later. So the like sort of secondary titles, like on the rationality of long-term commitment. So it's kind of taking the three attitudes, we'll see in a second, and then trying to show how they can help us keep our commitments over time. And so I wanted the title to kind of reflect that second part. So I added it kind of at the last minute. But yeah, that's the title.
Well, the link to the paper is in the description of the video. I would encourage you to go read it. It's really good. And let's dive in. Okay, so at the beginning of the paper, you talk about, well, actually, first, what's the overall goal of the paper? What are you trying to show?
Yeah, so maybe just kind of thinking about what is the topic of the goal. That's what I call long-term commitments. And so we have things, I mean, we might have a short-term commitment like I want to, I have this goal that I want to accomplish today, or I want to go do yoga after work or something. And I'm more thinking about in this paper longer term commitments that sort of stretch out over longer periods of time, often many years. So examples, marriage, I think is a good example. Maybe a commitment to get healthy, to start working out more and eating better. A commitment to learning a new instrument, like learning it well, finishing a degree, whether that's a PhD or even, a bachelor, whatever, any kind of degree, starting a new business. And then obviously kind of maybe the most salient and important for our purposes would be like a commitment to God or a religious commitment. So these kind of stretch out over a long period of time, and they're often like very important and central to our lives, as like, I want to do yoga after work, maybe not. I mean, it could be a part of one of these, but not as important and central, not as long term. And so we have these commitments, but sometimes we face obstacles that can kind of get in the way of, it can either make us feel like we don't want to be committed anymore, the commitment's not rational. And so really there's two main obstacles. The first is that we lose evidence. So we're like, did I marry the right person? Does God really exist? Is this new eating plan actually healthy? So we can lose evidence, and then we can also lose desire. So we might say like, I think God exists, but I don't know if God's the kind of person that I would want to commit my life to. Or maybe this person is a good person, but like I don't know if they're the right one for me. And so we can kind of lose evidence and lose desire, and both of these things can be obstacles to keeping these commitments. And so that's kind of a long answer, but that kind of brings us to the aim of the paper, which is what I want to do is appeal to belief, faith, and hope to kind of show how we can maintain these long-term commitments in the face of both of these obstacles, loss of evidence and loss of desire.
Cool. All right. So we're going to begin here, going through the paper. You start with this idea of acceptance. So what is acceptance?
Yeah. So acceptance is, well, maybe I'll say first of all, we accept propositions or statements that are true or false. And when we accept them, we basically act as if they're true. So, you know, I might accept that I'm going to do yoga at 6 p.m. today. Sorry, I just got back from a yoga class. So it's like, I keep bringing that example up. But, you know, I might accept that God exists. I act as if God exists. And, you know, I might like wonder if my husband did something with bad motives, but I'm just going to go ahead and accept that he had good motives to be like charitable to him. And so this example kind of gets at this idea that sometimes we actually accept things even if we don't flat out believe them. So a lot of the things that we believe we accept, and a lot of the things we accept that we believe. So I, you know, believe coffee will make me more efficient, wake me up in the morning, and so I act as if that's true. You know, lots of everyday examples of things we believe that we accept. But sometimes we kind of accept something even though we don't believe it, whether that's, you know, like for the sake of argument, or maybe because the stakes are really high. I'm going to give a bunch of examples of this in a second. But basically, acceptance is, it's an action. And it's kind of like a policy to act. Like, I'm going to act as if this thing is true. So it's connected to belief, but it comes apart from belief. And we're going to talk more about the relationship between belief and acceptance in a second. So,
Yeah, that was neat to, I had never really, I guess, thought about it. But when in the paper, when you said acceptance of a proposition is an action, I was thinking of it more like, you know, it's just almost something that you do involuntarily, like, oh yeah, of course I accept that. That just, but it is an action at base.
And maybe it's worth saying too, like, we can often, when we say like I accept that that's true, we really just mean I believe that that's true. So it might not always perfectly map onto the use of accept in English, but it's kind of, you can see it as like a technical term, but this is like the common usage in philosophy, which is when you accept something as true, you act as if it's true. So maybe that would clarify. Maybe some examples start to sound really beliefy, and maybe just in English sometimes accept means believe, but this is a distinct thing.
Now, what justifies acceptance of a proposition?
Yeah. So, okay. So remember, acceptance is an action or like a policy to act. So when we ask what makes acceptance rational or what justifies acceptance, we're really asking the question, what makes an action rational? What justifies acting in a certain way or taking on a certain policy to act in a certain way? And there's really two main components of what justifies action. And at least that these two are components is pretty uncontroversial. Some people think maybe more stuff plays in, but I think most people think these two are sort of two of them and kind of the big two. And so the first is what you might call the epistemic component. And so what the epistemic component is, I mean, it's basically like a belief or a confidence level. So to try to make it concrete, beliefs are often part of what justifies acceptance. But this epistemic component, it represents the world. It often tracks the truth. It's often responsive to evidence. And when we do epistemology, these are often the things that we're evaluating. So I talked about beliefs. Epistemologists also talk about credences, which are sort of like your levels of confidence. And so both kind of beliefs and confidence can kind of play the role of this epistemic component. So the second component has to do with more with desire. So let me just say that it's notable that you can be rational to accept something even if you don't have any desire for it to be true, but because you have really strong evidence that it's true, right? So I missed my flight or my flight was delayed. I don't want that to be true, but it's rational for me to both believe it and accept it. So acceptance can be a function of having really strong evidence. It can be rational because, you know, you believe something or you have really good evidence for it, even if you don't have the second desire component. So I'm going to say that because I'm just going to kind of contrast the two components. So the second component, the fancy word to be the axiological component, but that's like value-based or desire-based. We can even just use the word like desire component. But this component is about what's valuable or what's desirable. So it could just be what you want, what your desires are, or your preferences are. A fancy decision theory word could be utility function, but we probably don't need to go into all that. But this component is not sensitive necessarily to the way the world is or what's true, but it's sensitive to what would be good or what you want to be true. So like I said, this could be desires, preferences, maybe even beliefs about the good. That's kind of controversial because those are beliefs, but they're about the good, So the axiological component is not going to be it's not going to be as sensitive to evidence, at least in the same way. So you could have a bunch of evidence that, for example, God doesn't exist, but still really strongly want God to exist. Or you could have, a bunch of evidence that eating cake for breakfast isn't healthy, but still really want eating cake for breakfast to be healthy. Okay. And so, yeah, like I said, desiring something to be true can be rational, even if you don't have much evidence for it. And what's, I think, maybe even a more interesting point is that this actually brings out, I think, one way that acceptance and belief are very different. So accepting that something is true can be rational, even if you have very little evidence for that thing in question. And I think this is maybe a more subtle point and can be more difficult to see. So I'm going to give several examples from the paper. So the first is actually a case I've used probably even on this channel before. So, but it was in the paper. Maybe I should have come up with a different case, but I like this case. So your brother goes missing, and at first you think, oh, there's a good chance he's alive. Like, would he really be dead? And then the search parties go out, and time passes, and he's not found, and you're searching more and more and more, and further and further and further, and it just becomes more and more likely that he's dead. And so we can think about your confidence level. Maybe at first you're very confident he's alive, and then as your evidence goes down and down and down and down and down, you become less and less confident. So you become more confident that he's dead. However, just because, so let's say your confidence, you think there's like a less than 50% chance that your brother is still alive. It could still be rational for you to accept that your brother is alive, because of how good it would be if he were alive and how much you could gain. Maybe at a certain point, like he's been missing for 15 years and you're still taking out search parties every day. I mean, it's going to be too unlikely, right? But I think for quite a while, even if the probability that he's alive is below 0.5, it can still be rational for you to accept it, that he's alive. And part of that is because of this desire component, because of how good it would be if he were alive and you found him. So that's example one of acceptance being rational, even with a very weak epistemic component, because of the strong axiological or desire component. Another example, it's kind of modified off a case from William James, but you could take a case where you're hiking in the forest and you get lost and you can't find your way back home. You've been wandering around for hours, you're out of food, you're out of water. Suddenly you find, oh my gosh, this is the way back. I know that this path will take me back home. But as you're walking down that path, you encounter a pretty deep crevice. And it's pretty wide, like wide enough that you think there's a chance you could still jump across it, but like you're not sure. It's not like, it's just like 6 inches or something, right? It's like it would be a big jump. And again, it seems like you could have a credence, like you might think there's like a 50% chance I make this jump, or like a 45% chance. I mean, it might be below 0.5, but it still could be rational for you to accept that you're going to make the jump and go ahead and give it your very best shot, because of how good it would be if that was true, because your strong desire, again, to get back home. So we have a weaker epistemic component, but this desire component kind of makes that acceptance rational. Okay, the final case would be what I call it's like a frozen ice case. So you are out in the middle of winter, you have a bunch of children, and the children are like, Mommy, Daddy, I really want to go play on the ice. And you're like very confident that the ice is solid. Let's say you're 90% sure even that the ice is solid, but there's a chance that it's not. There's a chance that it's actually a lot thinner than you thought. But your evidence is still pretty good. But there's a really big risk involved to letting your 5-year-old child go out and play on the ice, right? If they fall in, that would be a huge loss. And there's not that much to be gained by just letting them go play on the ice. They can just go play somewhere that's way less dangerous, right? And so this is actually sort of a reverse case. You have really strong evidence for something, but it's rational for you not to accept it because of it would be so bad if that thing turned out to be true. If somehow you could become like 100% confident the ice was solid, maybe that's a different story. But as long as you're not 100%, there's a really big risk that you're taking here. And so it actually isn't rational for you to accept it. So these are cases where your preferences or your desires or sort of what you want makes acceptance come apart from where the way your evidence is pointing. Yeah, I think
So
that was
up to this point,
yeah.
we're saying there's these two components that justify acceptance of a proposition, the epistemic and the axiological.
Yeah.
Now, and the cases were really good at showing how the epistemic could be really high and the axiology really low in the frozen ice case. Or yeah, I think I said that right. But the idea is these things can fluctuate, and
Mm-hmm.
it could still, in any of these cases, it seems like acceptance of the proposition could be rational. Now, you mentioned that there are two models of I guess acceptance of propositions: the decision theory model, and then this belief desire model. So
Yeah.
can you explain each of those?
Yeah, so at this point you might be thinking like, well, you've given us a lot of cases and I kind of see that there's these two components that play in, but like how do we get the like, how do we decide whether acceptance is rational? Like in some cases the axiology component is really low and the epistemic one is really high and vice versa. And so, we don't have time to necessarily go into all of the details here, but there are kind of theories about how we can sort of take these two components, input them into some like function, I guess is a word you could use, so like some kind of thing, and then it can spit out and tell us whether acceptance is rational or not. And so the first is decision theory, which I know Jordan and I have talked about before. I think Jordan actually has a really excellent kind of intro to decision theory video. So check that out. It's in the Pascal's Wager playlist. But basically, with decision theory, you put your confidence levels or your credences in, and then you put your preferences in. And then basically, you can use some really simple math to sort of tell you what action is rational given those. Jordan has some really good examples of this in his Pascal's Wager video. The belief desire model actually isn't super different, but it's kind of less mathy, so it's maybe less precise in that sense. But basically what it says is that what makes an action rational is that it's appropriate, sort of given your beliefs and your desires. But like kind of beliefs, credences, they're kind of playing the same role here, and then preferences or desires are kind of playing the same role here. So in both, we have, again, this epistemic component, that's beliefs or credences, and then we have this axiological component, that's preferences or desires, and then those two kind of come together and then sort of can spit out from that whether acceptance is rational or not. So those are sort of the models. If you look at the paper, I cite some things that go into those in more detail, so if you're really interested in this, you should go check that out, but I think we maybe want to leave the details for another day, if that sounds right, Jordan.
All right. So up to this point, we've said acceptance is just acting as if something's true.
Yeah.
And acceptance can be rational or justified using acceptance of a proposition, I should say. That's what we're talking about. Accepting a proposition can be justified on the basis of the way that these two components work together, the epistemic and the axiological. Now, you say that there are three attitudes we can take that, if I'm understanding this right, there are three attitudes that make acceptance rational. And those are belief, faith, and hope. So we're going to go through each one of these at a time. Let's start with belief. So what is belief?
So belief is taking something to be the case. It's regarding something to be true. If I believe it's going to rain tomorrow, I take that to be the case and I regard that thing to be true. So belief doesn't necessarily mean I desire that. Maybe I have a picnic planned and I actually want it to be sunny tomorrow. But I nonetheless check the forecast and form the belief it will rain tomorrow.
Okay. So how does belief make acceptance rational then?
Yeah. So when we believe something, what we're sort of doing is we're representing the world in that way. We're kind of saying to ourselves, this thing is true. And so I think it's pretty natural from that to see that, like, yeah, if you think this thing is true, you should act on that thing. And in a lot of cases, if it's rational for you to act on something, then you believe it. So, like, Cohen is one of the big people that kind of talked about acceptance and brought it up. And he said, in most cases, we accept what we believe and we believe what we accept, right? Again, like, if I believe coffee is going to wake me up, I drink it in the morning. If I believe that my car is parked down the street over there and I need to drive somewhere, then I accept that. I walk down the street and go find my car, right? And again, it's normally rational to act on our beliefs, even in cases where we don't desire them to be true. So that said, I think there can be some exceptions to it's always if you believe something, it's always rational to accept it. So here's a potential case. I don't think this is in the paper, but it's a case, yeah, that I think illustrates this well. You have very good evidence and believe that your friend's spouse is cheating on them. But your evidence isn't perfect. So a lot of times when we believe things, we have good evidence. We don't always have to have perfect evidence. Otherwise, that would lead to skepticism, basically, saying, like, if we always have to have perfect evidence, then I don't even have perfect evidence that there's a table in front of me. So you can believe things on good but not perfect evidence. And you say, look, I have good evidence that my friend's partner or spouse is cheating, but it's not perfect evidence. I think there's still a chance that I'm wrong about that belief. And I'm going to wait until I have more decisive evidence before I go act on that and start, like, telling a bunch of people or something, because the stakes are really high. And I want to be sure that this thing is true before I act on it. One more quick case really quickly. You could think about a doctor who believes that I need to operate on this patient's left leg, but goes and checks one more time before they act on that, just because if they operated on the wrong leg, that would be really bad. I remember I had ACL surgery and the nurse actually came and marked my leg. This is the right one. Okay, good. Just to make extra sure they don't, try to repair an ACL that doesn't need repairing. So those are cases of really high stakes where, you are believing something, but it may not be rational to act on that belief. So belief and acceptance often go together. I think in most cases, belief justifies acceptance, but there can be these kind of really high stakes cases where you maybe shouldn't, you believe something, but you shouldn't act on that belief.
Okay. So sorry, my dog is barking in the background, so you may hear her. All right. So yeah, that seems pretty clear to me. In most cases, when you believe something, you're going to accept it, though they can come apart. Now, let's talk about faith now. And ultimately, I want to just gradually build up to faith, because given that this is the analytic Christian, faith is going to be an important topic for Christians. So I want to emphasize the faith part too, but we're building our way up to the unique role that faith can play. But first, what is faith?
Yeah, so I have, like, other papers where I give a full definition, so I'm not going to necessarily go through all the components. But I guess to start off, so there's a debate about faith and belief. Every time you have faith that something's true, do you have to believe it's true or not? I actually, no matter what you say about that debate, everything's consistent with my argument. So I don't have to take a stand on that. But just for the purposes of the paper, I assume that there could be cases where you have faith even if you don't believe. So some people think, well, maybe you're relatively confident, or you think this thing's, like, very likely true, but I'm not quite to the point where I believe. Some people think maybe in those kinds of cases you could still have faith. So you still have something playing that epistemic role, but it's not a flat out belief. Other people say, no, that can't work. That's, I think William Lane Craig says that's unbiblical. Other people say that would lead to people, like, faking it or pretending in this problematic way. I'm actually not totally convinced of that objection, but anyway, there's a debate here. I'm going to kind of just assume that you could have faith without belief, but if you think you think that's impossible, totally fine. That actually makes my argument stronger, because then it's easy to argue there's a connection between faith and acceptance, because you can just rely on the connection between belief and acceptance. Okay, so let's say faith doesn't always involve belief. Well, I think faith still involves some kind of epistemic component. Again, whether that's some level of confidence or credence, whether that's thinking this thing is at least 50% true, or the most likely of all the alternatives, or whatever. So if I say, Jordan, I have faith that your channel is going to do really well in the future, But I actually think it's very likely that it's just going to crash and burn. I mean, that seems weird, right? Like, maybe I have some doubts. Maybe I'm not 100% sure your channel is going to do well, but I need to at least think there's some evidence for that or have some kind of epistemic component there. So if you buy that, you might think that faith's epistemic component is decently strong, but it's a little weaker than beliefs. If you have so many doubts you can't believe, maybe you could still have faith if you have a little bit less evidence or lower confidence or something. One thing, though, that makes faith very different than belief, we said you can believe stuff, and we believe stuff all the time, but have no desire for it to be true. Faith is actually very different. So if you have faith that something is true, that involves some kind of desire for that thing to be true. Let's take that same example. I say, Jordan, I have faith the Analytic Christian is going to do really well and get lots of new subscribers. And then I say, but I really hope it crashes and burns. Like, I think it's really likely that it's going to do well, but I hope it doesn't. I'm really against it for whatever reason, right? Again, it doesn't seem like I really have faith, because I really am not. I'm not for your channel. I don't view it in a positive light. I view it as a negative thing for whatever reason. And so faith involves a desire in a way that belief doesn't. And so I agree that faith is like very central. I think the hope stuff is cool too, because like hope is also like an important theological virtue, and I think there's cool stuff we can say about hope. But I think what's cool about faith is that we were just talking about acceptance, and then what justifies it, and it's the epistemic stuff, and then the desire-based stuff. And look what we've just seen about faith. Faith actually involves those exact two conditions that we just discussed. So this is why I think faith, when we think about the commitments that we started with at the beginning, marriage, meeting your goals, picking up a new instrument, starting a business, or a commitment to God, faith is like a big term that comes to mind, whether it's faith in your spouse, faith in God, faith in yourself, that you can, accomplish whatever goal you have. And so I think that actually makes a lot of sense, because faith like very clearly fulfills these two components of rational action that we've been talking about. And I think is really like, for when we talk about belief versus faith versus hope, it's kind of this one that like really powers us through in these commitments. And notice too that when you're kind of unwilling to act on something, often that's taken as an indicator that you don't have faith. So you might say, oh, I have faith that your channel is going to do well, but like, I'm not going to do anything to support you at all. Like, I'm not going to become a patron. I'm not going to share your videos. I'm not, I just like, it's too risky. I refuse to help you or do anything, or like, I have faith this chair will hold me, but I'm not sitting in it, I mean, it just seems like there's something at least a little fishy there. Like, it kind of seems like if you're really totally unwilling to accept it, we start to question whether you really have faith. I have faith that my spouse isn't cheating on me, but I'm going to go like check his emails and texts behind his back all the time, right? Like, no, yeah, a lot of those kinds of actions indicate you don't have faith. And so part of what I think comes out of this, maybe I already answered the second question. I don't know if we got to this or not. Sorry, I might be jumping ahead, but there's a tight connection, I think, between faith and acceptance. And actually philosophers have argued for this and noticed this. So Alston, for example, has a paper where he argues that actually acceptance plays a bigger role in faith than even belief does. So a lot of people kind of think that faith and acceptance are closely connected, and I think for good reason.
Yeah, I think once you define what we mean by faith, or at least that faith has to have these two components, there's an epistemic and an axiological component, then it does seem like, okay, then yeah, in many paradigm cases like you're talking about in your paper of faith, like marriage, for example, it seems like acceptance is rational, and you've already given some cases there. So did you want to say anything else about how faith makes acceptance rational before we move on?
No, I think we've basically covered it, and at the end we'll kind of come back to it one more time. So why don't we keep going?
Yeah. Okay, so now let's talk about hope. And I'm so glad you mentioned, hope is important in Christianity too, because if I have it correctly, I think somewhere in 1 Corinthians, maybe like 13 or 14, somewhere in there, Paul's like, these three things endure forever: faith, hope, and love. And so these are like three Christian virtues. And so hope's really important too. So what is hope?
Yeah, I did faith, hope, and belief. I should have done faith, hope, and love. I actually think love is kind of an underexplored and really interesting, like, philosophical question. Anyway, that's not the topic of this interview, but yeah, faith and hope and love, very central. So, okay, so first of all, when it comes to the question of what is hope, I actually want to make a distinction, which I talk about in the paper, and that's between prosaic hopes and profound hopes. You could also, some people use the word mundane hopes instead of prosaic hopes, so either one really works. But these are hopes that are just kind of like one-off little like things that we hope. So, oh, Jordan, hope you have a nice day today, or like, I hope our picnic doesn't get rained out tomorrow. I hope my third cousin twice removed, gets that job he applied for. We do hope these things. Like, I'm not saying that like these aren't real hopes, but like they're not that important to us. We kind of like, if something happens that like causes us to give up the hope, we give it up pretty easily. They're not these things that are shaping our life commitments. They're just sort of one-off little desires that we have. So those are mundane or prosaic hopes. Then there's what's called profound hopes. So profound hopes are these life-shaping, extremely important and central hopes. And so, as a religious person, your hope for the afterlife, or a political activist's hope for world peace, or for some, political thing they've been maybe fighting for their whole lives. And so really in this paper, I'm more talking about the profound hopes, and that kind of fits well with these commitments we're talking about at the beginning, rather than like, oh, I hope my yoga teacher's nice, oh, I hope my cord didn't break, that it's not that kind of thing. So we're really focused on these profound hopes. And so, maybe I'll say a little bit about hope, which does apply to both, but then we'll kind of move our focus to profound hope. So when it comes to the two components that we've been talking about, the epistemic component and then the desire component, it's kind of interesting, and we'll show this chart, maybe not now, but maybe in a second, and I think it'll kind of bring out how this contrasts with belief and faith. But notice that when you hope for something, you don't have to be certain of it. You don't have to think it's very likely. You don't even have to think it's like 50% likely to be true. You really just have to think it's possible, or you could say you don't have a credence of zero in it. You're not certain that it's false. And so I can hope that my picnic isn't rained out, to use a more mundane example, even if there's a 90% chance of rain tomorrow. And I can, hope that this party doesn't win the upcoming election, even if it's looking very likely that they do. And so we notice belief that requires a ton of evidence, or at least pretty good evidence. Belief has this strong epistemic component. Faith, maybe more in the middle. Maybe it requires some good amount of confidence, or thinking the thing is most likely of the live options, or something. Hope, all it requires is that you think the thing is possible, or you don't have a credence of zero in it. So it's a weaker epistemic component. The epistemic component is, in fact, like probably as weak as you can get while still having an epistemic component, right? Yeah. On the other hand, we said beliefs, there's no desire component. There's lots of things you believe you don't desire at all. Faith goes along with desire. And hope, I would say, so in the paper, I try to give some reasons that hope maybe involves even a stronger desire than faith, but at least involves a similar kind of desire to faith. And when you think about it, we often use hope and desire kind of interchangeably. I want you to win your game, or I hope that you win. I want to eat eggs for breakfast, and I really hope I can have eggs for breakfast, So hope and desire are kind of very closely connected. And in the paper, I give some reasons to think that the desire is involved with hope. And then especially, remember, we're focusing on profound hope. So we're not like, I hope my cousin gets his job. We're like, I hope for an afterlife, like very important central hopes. Those are going to be even stronger, more central desires that you're way less likely to give up. And so hope, remember, we had really weak epistemic component, but really strong axiological or desire-based component. And so I think it's kind of interesting how, as we move from belief to hope, one component kind of goes down, but the other kind of goes up. So that's sort of the picture here, and hopefully also sheds light a little bit on the nature of hope.
Yeah. Okay, now how does hope make acceptance rational? This
Yeah.
one seems hard because on the face of it, you want to, it seems like that belief component is pretty important.
Yeah.
And yeah, so, but because hope has such a low epistemic uh,
Yeah. So
component,
maybe,
it seems difficult. But yeah,
yeah,
you
yeah.
give some good cases.
Well, maybe I'll say first too. My view isn't that all hoping makes acceptance rational. So just because you hope for something, going back to an ice case, I hope that this ice is. I really hope that this ice is solid because I really want to ice skate right now. But like I can see it cracking right in front of me. But like maybe I'm just seeing things. Maybe there's that doesn't make acceptance rational, right? So my view isn't that all hopes always make acceptance rational, no matter what.
Hmm.
That's going to actually depend on some of the stuff we were talking about earlier, which is the exact axiological component, and then also how it fits into either the decision theory or the belief desire model. Okay, so I do want to kind of put that big caveat on this. It's like not all hopes are rational, make acceptance rational no matter what. But I do think some cases of hope do make acceptance rational. And actually, we can even look back at, remember, we were saying sometimes it's rational to accept that something's true, even on very little evidence that that thing is true. The missing brother case, it's maybe I just hope that my brother's still alive and I don't even have enough evidence to have faith that he's still alive, but I have this super strong desire. And so I continue to accept that he's still alive. Crevice jumping, maybe it's a similar case. Maybe I don't have enough evidence to have faith that I'll make the jump across this really big, really wide crevice. But honestly, it's that or I die in the wilderness, right? There's a chance I make it, and it would be so good if I made it. So again, hope is justifying that acceptance. I actually don't think that, I think there can be more mundane cases of this too. So this is a real life story. Student, very irresponsible student, comes to maybe half the classes at best, constantly texting in class, failed the first paper, that kind of student. I think you get the idea. And I'm like, I think my evidence is that the student isn't even going to write the second paper, given how much they've been acting up in class, and maybe they never wrote the first paper. I have a bunch of evidence they're not going to do it, but there is a chance that they do it. And so I hope that they do it because I want them to do well and I care about them. They're one of my students. So I assign them to a peer review group, acting as if they're going to write this paper and turn it in on time, even though my confidence that they're going to do that is very small. I think it's possible. If I thought it was impossible, like maybe if the student passed away, right, then I wouldn't assign them to a peer review group, right? I think there's a chance, but it's very small. And because of how good it would be, if they did actually get their paper turned in on time and then participated in this peer review activity, it's rational for me to act as if they'll turn their paper in by assigning them to a peer review group. So that's a little bit actually more of a everyday, more mundane case. But there's actually a literature, a philosophical literature on what people call trials. So trials are these really long, really difficult, almost like, I don't want to say the word test, but they're like, it's like kind of what we were talking about at the beginning. Like they really test your commitment and they test your ability to persevere. So surviving like a very serious cancer, that could be like a trial. Maybe going through a really, really tough period in your marriage for whatever reason. A very serious example would be reading stories about people who actually survived and made it through concentration camps. So these really tough, really difficult things that you go through, that like are just rife with doubt. Like when you're going through these kinds of things, it's like maybe the cancer you have, maybe you have a significantly less than 50% chance of survival. I mean, I can imagine in the concentration camp, the probability that you get out of there, like that's got to be so low. But this literature, I think, is one thing that's interesting is like, even though your confidence is so low, because of kind of this hope of what's on the other side, what like this outcome, like I actually survive this, I actually make it out of this concentration camp, like we actually like get through this point in our marriage and like continue on this happy marriage and stay together. I think hope in those cases can make continuing to accept the relevant propositions that underlie that commitment rational. And so I think there's some really powerful, important cases of this. I don't think it's just this trivial thing, and I think it's actually, in a lot of cases, a really important part of continuing in these commitments. And I think this can apply to the religious case as well. So I think there can be cases where you undergo really serious doubts. Like, you might start off believing God exists or believing that Christianity or fill in the religion is true, and then you're losing evidence, and then you're kind of just relying on your faith, and then you keep losing evidence, but you have hope. You have this hope that, like, look how good it would be if I continued in this commitment and God really did exist, even though, like, I have no freaking clue why there's so much evil in the world. Maybe God seems really absent to me. Maybe I'm just struggling with a ton of doubts about, like, specific occurrences in my life of evils or difficulties or things I just don't understand. But look, how good would it be if God did exist and I continued to pursue God? I think that kind of hope can actually make accepting that God exists rational. So I think maybe we should have made religious cases more front and center, but I do think all of these apply to the case of accepting that God exists. And I think hope definitely does.
All right. So up to this point, this chart summarizes basically
Hey,
everything.
yeah. I
And
hope
yeah, I guess, yeah, walk us through like the 60-second version of where we've been so far in this interview.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of what I've been trying to say, but maybe the visual will really be helpful for people. So at the top, that column, the two middle rows, the epistemic requirement and the cognitive requirement. Remember, those are our two, or sorry, conative. Okay, so I'll just say really quickly, conative, axiological, desire. Just those, I'm using those all interchangeably. So sorry, I switched terminology, but the epistemic requirement and then the conative or axiological requirement, those are our two components of rational action. And so then we have in the first column, belief, faith, and hope. And so those are the three attitudes we've just been talking about. And so notice that belief, when it comes to belief, the epistemic requirement is very high. Like we said, it might not be that everything you believe you're 100% certain of, but beliefs are things that we have good evidence for. But there's no desire requirement. There's no cognitive requirement at all. Faith, both are kind of medium. So maybe faith has a lesser epistemic requirement than belief, but it has a much stronger desire-based or conative requirement. Hope, what we just talked about, has, again, the lowest epistemic requirement you could really get, which is all you have to do is think the thing is possible or not be 100% confident that it's false. But it has a very high conative requirement. You could say as high as faith or maybe even higher, depending on sort of what your view is of the relationship between faith and hope. And so then, because they have these two elements of rational action, belief, it has this really strong epistemic component, and that justifies accepting P in most cases. Faith, it has both of these, the epistemic and the conative, and so it involves rationally accepting P in all cases. The P is the proposition in question. So God exists, or my spouse is the right person to marry, or I can make it through this concentration camp, right? And then hope, I think I make the weakest claim here, which is that it involves rationally accepting P in many cases. And again, I think there's still a number of cases where just because you hope something's true doesn't mean you should act on it. But I still think there's a couple different classes of really interesting cases where hope does justify acceptance. So hopefully that, like, visual sort of helps people sort of see what I'm going for here.
Yep. All right.
Awesome.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. So far, that's like the groundwork. I see that's kind of like stage one. We've set the stage, but now we're going to get into more specifics.
Mm-hmm.
So first, how can long-term significant commitments be rational when we lose desire? Take out the axiological component.
Yeah, maybe I'll kind of answer this by focusing on the case of theism, because I think that's interesting, but it also applies to other cases as well, and maybe I can bring those in too. But say that you make a religious commitment, and when you first make that commitment, you're very confident that God exists, and you really want God to exist. You think it would be a good thing if God existed. And I think this is probably true for a lot of people when they first kind of make a religious commitment. But maybe instead of the problem of evil making you question whether God exists at all, maybe it just makes you question God's goodness. And you're like, is God is God really someone that I should want to commit my life to if there's all this evil in the world? Like, would God, like, is God's existence actually a good thing? And like, God's like invading my privacy. And, maybe a bunch of people's lives would be meaningless if God exists because they don't know about God. And so maybe there's reasons that make you lose like so maybe like I was kind of more giving like rational like actually arguments that it would be a bad thing for God to exist. And you might also just like lose your desire. Like a lot of people, if you go to church camp or kind of have like a road to Damascus sort of conversion experience, I think you're really passionate, you're really into it at the beginning, and your desires, like over time, they just kind of fade. You kind of get out of that honeymoon phase, right? So I think it could really apply to either case. Case one would be you're actually confronted with a bunch of evidence that it wouldn't be a good thing if God existed. And case two is like your desires just kind of fade over time, even if that's not in response to like reasons, right? So in either case, the thought is, well, maybe at the beginning you believe that God exists and you have faith that God exists and you hope that God exists. But your desire, it's kind of fading. And maybe it's like, I don't know if I hope that God exists anymore. Depending on what we want to say about faith, maybe you're sort of on that line where it's like you need to desire God to exist a little bit more to really have faith. We can talk more about that, but the thought is, if you still have that strong epistemic component and you're like, you know what, my feelings aren't here, I don't really want to do this, but like I know God exists, like I have this strong evidence that I can't ignore. I'm really just confident that this thing is true, even though I'm not in the honeymoon phase anymore, even though I don't want it to be true, or at least don't want it to be true very strongly or whatever. I'm going to continue in my religious commitment because I believe that God exists. And so this epistemic component, I think, can kind of keep you going, even though you're really questioning whether God's existence would be a good thing. And I think you can say something similar about the other cases we've been talking about. Like in a marriage, I think most people know at the beginning you're just in this honeymoon phase and you just like, oh, I just love my spouse, I just want to be with them all the time, I just whatever. And like that does fade over time. I mean, that's often, you're not in the honeymoon phase the whole time. But because of the things you believe and know to be true about yourself and your spouse and your commitment, even as your desires fade, you can continue to be rational in that. So part of it is, I think, just like helping you continue when you're kind of in the I'm not feeling it stage. But even if you're really getting serious doubts about God's goodness, I also think that the fact that you have this evidence can keep you going, can help you continue in that long-term commitment.
So the main idea there is when the axiological component diminishes, so long as the epistemic component is still medium to high,
Yeah.
that can kind of carry you along so that you remain committed.
Yeah. Like maybe I can give one more case that like would make this clear. Like, so let's say your brother goes missing. This is a different version of the brother case, right? But instead of you getting a bunch of evidence that he's not around, maybe you're like getting little letters from him and like you have like decent evidence he's still alive. But like you find out he did something really bad or like betrayed you or something. And you're like, oh, I'm so mad at him. And like, I don't know if I really want to like see him or like find him or whatever. But like I have decent evidence he's still alive and like he is my brother, and like deep down, like, like, I kind of have this commitment, like in virtue of him being my brother. I mean, of course, it would depend on the details of the betrayal and stuff. But let's say it's not like, he murdered the rest of your family or something. Like, I think in that would be another case where like your axiological component, your desire to find your brother goes down, but like because your evidence is medium to high, then you can continue to be rational to search for him. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
All right. Now, I made this one like basically the title of the interview. I think a lot of people will be interested in the answer to this question. So instead of losing desire, now it's like we're losing evidence.
Yeah.
And so I'll just ask the question: how can long-term significant commitments be rational when we're facing counter evidence? Like, we get a lot of counter evidence.
Mm-hmm. I think the first thing happens sometimes, but I think this is the more common case. People make a commitment and then they're like, I don't know if, whatever the propositions underlying this commitment, I don't know if they're true anymore. We can again kind of stick with the God case. So you make a commitment to God, maybe you have good evidence, you believe that God exists at the beginning, and again, you have this strong desire. You're like, look, if I continue in this commitment and God exists, that would be a really good thing. And then I think this happens to a lot of us. You start seeing these arguments against God's existence. We've talked about some of them already, like the problem of evil and the problem of divine hiddenness. And you might question, like, why does the Bible have these like weird Old Testament passages? I mean, lots of things that actually are talked about on this channel. These kind of objections to Christianity, or some people say like Christianity is sexist, or Christianity condones slavery, or whatever. And so you might just like be like, how can this be true? I used to believe it. Maybe I think it's 50-50. Maybe I think it's less than 50-50. And so my model actually, I think, it kind of works in a similar way. But instead of kind of relying on belief to keep you anchored, you're kind of relying on either faith or hope to keep you anchored. So I think that, again, if we think that there are cases where you could have faith, even if you don't believe something, you might start off believing, you doubt so much, you get so much counter evidence that you're really in the faith range. So you're in it, you're confident. You're not like, I think the probability of this is close to 0, but you're not like close to certain either. You're kind of maybe more in the middle. That might be a case where you still have faith. You still have faith that God exists, even though your confidence level is not nearly as high as it would be if you believed. So I think like getting significant counter evidence doesn't always have to push you all the way down. Like, I think sometimes it could just push you down a little bit. But what I think is kind of interesting is that even if you get so much counter evidence that you're like, Christianity is enormously unlikely. Maybe it's possible. This is like ontological argument style, but very different, right? Maybe it's possible, but I can't really say much beyond that. Like, I think it's very unlikely to be true. The thought is, you can actually still be rational in continuing to accept that God exists on the basis of hope. Similar to the person says, I'm never going to get out of this concentration camp, but they continue, they don't lose hope and they continue to act as if they could. The person who says, my brother, I think he is probably gone forever, and I think there's just a low chance that he's still alive, but I haven't given up hope yet. And I think that exact same thing can apply to a religious commitment. I think, obviously there's huge questions about how this relates to salvation. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm just talking about being rational in accepting God's existence, being rational in accepting, doing things like going to church, praying, reading the Bible, doing things that you would do if God did exist. That's what acceptance is. And you can be rational to accept God's existence, even if you're like, I don't even have faith. I just hope that it's true. And I think that's pretty cool. I think that's pretty interesting. And I think, at least for me, it kind of gives me freedom to say, these religious practices I'm engaging in, and the fact that I'm accepting God's existence, even if I encounter very serious counter evidence, I can continue in those things and not worry about that being irrational or not feeling like I'm a hypocrite, because of how good it would be if I continued in this commitment and God did actually exist. And I think there's a lot of non-religious examples that support that as well. So I'm not making this like ad hoc plea, like you can do this in a religious case, but never anywhere else. No, I think we do that. I think we do this in other cases all the time anyway. You're like, is my favorite restaurant, I really want to go eat it. Oh, I think it closes at 9, but maybe it closes at 10. Let's just go check. You really want that restaurant, and it's like less than a 50% chance that it's open, and maybe Google Maps isn't accurate or whatever. So you just go check. You accept that it's open in case there's a chance you're right. It's kind of like that. Like, you accept that God exists in case there's a chance that God does exist, and you continue in this commitment to God and continue to pursue God in light of your very serious doubts, because of how good it is to have that relationship with this all good, all powerful creator of the universe who loves you. So hopefully, am I missing anything, Jordan? I hope that's getting the point.
I think you hit the highlights there.
Cool.
All right, we're coming up on an hour, and we are
Yeah.
going to be taking questions. So I've seen one from Nahoa Life in the live chat. And if you have questions, just put the word question at the beginning. Go ahead and start putting them there. We'll get to them quickly. All right. What does all this mean, Liz, for agnostics and atheists?
Yeah, so I actually kind of want to treat those two separately. Because, well, okay, again, this is going to depend on whether you think you could have faith if you don't believe. Okay, so again, you can think faith always goes along with belief and accept everything that I'm saying here. But if you were open to this idea that maybe there are cases of faith even without belief, then actually someone who is agnostic could have faith if they still had, a decent confidence level that God existed or that Christianity was true, and they had that desire component. They wanted it to be true. So an agnostic could actually, in theory, fulfill those two components of faith. Actually, in order to have faith, there's a few other components that I argue for elsewhere that they would also need to fulfill, but those are actually consistent with being agnostic if you buy this idea that faith doesn't entail belief. So what's cool and interesting is like you could be an agnostic Christian. I've heard people use that term. I can't remember who it was. I once heard a pastor identify as that, which is very interesting. I'm sure very controversial. I'm sure a lot of people weren't into that. But I mean, I think at the very least, everyone can agree that you can be a Christian and have very serious doubts. Like the question is, can those doubts push you to agnosticism? But if you kind of buy, again, that faith and belief can be disconnected, you can be an agnostic and rationally continue in your commitment to God, and have faith that God exists. Okay, atheism, I want to treat differently. I think it's probably implausible that you could be an atheist and have genuine faith that God exists because you believe that God doesn't exist. You represent the world such that God doesn't exist. And so I think it's a stronger stance. It's a stronger attitude. Oh yeah, and I guess like there's this whole thing like atheism is a lack of belief. I'm just kind of setting that aside. Like philosophers think atheism is the belief that God doesn't exist. So that's what we're talking about here. Okay, so what does it mean though to actually be an atheist? And this actually relates to my dissertation topic, which is about the relationship between a belief attitude and a credence or a confidence level. So you can be an atheist, but nonetheless say, I'm not 100% sure that God exists. In the same way that I believe my car is parked outside, but I'm not 100% sure of that. You just have like a not as part of the proposition, right? You believe that God does not exist, but you think there's a chance you're wrong, right? Not all atheists are going to be 100% sure of atheism. And in fact, I think they probably shouldn't be 100% sure. That's like a very strong claim. So given that, you could actually be an atheist, but say there's a chance that God exists and I really want God to exist and actually hope that God exists. I'm not saying that atheists can be saved. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that I think an atheist could actually be rational in accepting that God exists and kind of trying it out, going to church, praying, reading the Bible, doing these things that, at least in terms of the actions that they're taking, constitute some level of commitment to God. So yeah, again, here, I'm not saying like that is sufficient for salvation. I think that's a huge issue and actually involves a lot of like Bible interpretation, which I'm not an expert in. But the point is just that in terms of having on some level of religious commitment, you could actually be an atheist, but be rational in accepting God exists. And in that sense, have some kind of religious commitment, which I think is kind of interesting. Yeah.
All right. With all this said, what's the unique power of faith in your view?
Yeah, I kind of already answered this, but I'll just sort of briefly say it again because I do think faith is really central. And so remember on our chart, belief had no axiological or conative component. Hope had only a very, very weak epistemic component. So both of those are kind of lacking, or at least mostly lacking, one of the key components of rational acceptance. But faith has a medium and sometimes even high component of both the epistemic and the desire-based component. And so what I think is interesting, and also notice too, we said sometimes we believe things we don't accept, and sometimes, if not, a decent amount of time, we hope for things we don't accept. But faith and acceptance are extremely closely connected, and I think it's plausible that if you have faith that something is true, you should act as if that thing is true. Faith always rationalizes acceptance. And that's because faith has a good amount of both of these components. And so, again, I kind of said this already, but that's why when we talk about commitments, religious, marriage, our goals, whatever, faith is such a natural thing to talk about. Faith in your spouse, faith in God, faith in yourself. Commitment and faith are very closely intertwined, and faith is a very important, huge part of keeping our commitments, I think, because it has both of these components of acceptance. So faith has, I think, a power in rationalizing acceptance and rationalizing commitment that belief and hope do not.
And that came out in the chart, because you say involves rationally accepting P, and you said for when you have faith that P, it's going to be all cases, right?
Right. And again, we talked about if you're not willing to act on something, we start to question whether you have faith. I gave the chair example. I have faith my spouse isn't cheating, but I'm still checking all his text messages. So I think faith and acceptance are going to be actually the two most closely connected attitudes. And belief and hope, I think, have a role to play. I'm not saying they don't matter, but I think faith has this sort of unique power and sort of this unique significance.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay. Awesome. So we're going to go to questions now. I've seen a few. Well, actually, I've only seen one in the live chat. But before we take the questions, let me say this. So I'm a high school teacher coming up on summer vacation. I don't want to take on a summer job. I'd love to spend my time this summer creating video content. And you can actually help in that process by supporting me on Patreon. You not only get early access to videos, but you also get to be a part of a private Facebook group where you can ask your questions and have discussions with other people. You can also participate in the book club if you sign up for any amount to be a patron. Doesn't have to be a certain amount. Any amount, you get to participate in the book club. And we're actually voting right now on the book that will be starting next month in June. So please consider becoming a patron. You can go to the link in the description of this video to sign up. All right.
I've been to one or two book clubs, and I have been kind of sick. And so I do hope to return. So I do recommend book club. The ones I went to are awesome. And I also just recommend becoming a patron because the Analytic Christian's awesome. So endorse.
I appreciate that, Liz.
Yeah.
Okay. Nahoa Life. By the way, Nahoa, I watched your interview with Sean McDowell. I was super impressed with you, man. You're doing a great job. Really, really bright. So, and thank you. I've seen you in the live channel, my other videos. I really appreciate you watching my channel. All right. Nahoa asked this: does Dr. Jackson think unbelief or even apostasy can be rational?
That's a good question. So I think it depends. So unbelief, we can maybe start there. So yes, and that is actually part of the model, right? Because in the model, I say when you lose evidence at a certain point, you got to give up the belief, but that's when you move to faith or to hope. And so, yeah, I think beliefs are things that, especially when rational, they're responsive to evidence. And yes, unbelief can be rational. I mean, one interesting question is, and I've done some other work on this, maybe you can actually hold on to your belief and just kind of lower your confidence, at least to a certain point. So maybe you can actually hold on to that belief longer than you thought. But I do think that at a certain point, you're just going to have too much counter evidence, and you got to give up that belief. It can't be rational to believe something if your evidence is just clearly pointing the other way, for example. So apostasy, I mean, yeah. So one thing that's kind of interesting about this paper is I'm like, acceptance that God exists is rational in this huge range of cases, right? And so if by apostasy you mean not accepting that God exists or not acting as if God exists, then actually that's going to be a trickier case, or at least I'm going to have a much more nuanced answer as to when that could be rational. But I think kind of Jordan said this, you do need at least like a moderate amount of at least one of the components. And so like we talked about like the epistemic component can go down or like the desire component can go down, right? But like if they both go down, like you aren't going to hope, right? Because hope requires a strong desire. So if you're in a place where you're like, I think it's extremely unlikely that God exists, and like there's nothing in it for me, like I just don't think that if God existed, that me committing to God would be a good thing, I have no desire for God to exist at all, then that would be a case where, given kind of this model, you shouldn't accept that God exists. I think that's probably going to be rarer, though. I mean, I think maybe the more like traditional thing is like, oh, you get enough evidence and you should just give it up. And this is saying, no, like maybe that's not enough. In some cases, you're going to have the loss of evidence and the loss of desire. But yeah, I think those could be cases where maybe it isn't rational for you to accept that God exists. So there is a video that I think Cameron did with hold on, sorry, Apologetics Squared. I was blanking on the name he uses on YouTube, where he actually argues that willful deconversion is never rational. So he kind of brought up some interesting stuff there that people could check out. But yeah, at least on the picture I'm painting today, it would be rational when both of the components were sort of too low. So hopefully that answers that.
Mm-hmm.
And also, Nahona and I have emailed a little bit about the axiology of theism. So hello.
Cool. All right. That looks like the last question in the live chat, and we're just over an hour, so I think that's a good time to ask you this, Liz.
Yeah.
How would you like to conclude this discussion?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I mean, I think one thing, so I've written a lot of papers and on a lot of different topics, but actually in terms of the personal importance, like this paper is actually one of the most personally important to me. And I think philosophy can be, and I'm sure some reviewers have experienced this, one of those things that you look at and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, like maybe numbers exist, maybe they don't, but like, who cares, you know? But one thing I actually really appreciate about I think just what we've been talking about tonight is that I think it really does have a practical import. I think both for commitments that we make kind of in general, marriage and like, you know, all these like other commitment things that I talked about, but also for religious commitment. And I think it shows that desire actually has a more important role to play in commitment than you might have thought. And these commitments can be rational even in the face of pretty serious obstacles. And so to me, while this is like this philosophical discussion, relying on philosophical theories, it's actually been really helpful for me to kind of see this stuff, and I hope it's been helpful for other people as well. And I think it has this really practical impact, which is like, just because you doubt a little bit, or just because your desire is fading a little bit, that doesn't mean you need to just jump ship and throw the baby out with the bathwater and give up the commitment. And so I think, at least for me personally, realizing that there's flexibility here. There's these sliding scales, and it's not just this all or nothing thing. And even if you lose like a ton of one, like the other can still kind of keep you floating, keep you up. That's been really personally helpful, and I hope it's been helpful for the audience as well.
I appreciate you coming on, and I thought this was a really helpful paper too.
Awesome.
It definitely reveals just how nuanced these the views are, and it definitely, I think, especially for somebody that maybe has faith already, you know, somebody in the Christian worldview, say, when they encounter challenges in the form of losing desire or facing counter evidence, I genuinely hope that an interview like this could be of service and make people think like, yeah, my epistemic component went down some, but my axiological component is still really high, and I'm still in a good faith spot there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
everything we said in discussion. So I think it's really practical too.
Awesome. I really do hope it helps people. And I think it's just knowing the models and knowing what philosophers say in these theories of rationality, I think is really important. Because again, it's easy to say, I lost some evidence, so I should give up the commitment. And that's actually just not true. So yeah, I think it's a good way to put it. It's more nuanced. So yeah.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Liz. I really appreciate it. And go and check out my interview with Liz. I think the title is Christianity versus Truth, and how to be a Christian and a truth seeker. Something like that. go check that interview out. We talk more about beliefs and credences and how you can still believe something even when your credence is getting lower and lower and lower. So go check that out. And thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.